covered that today because someone else already pointed out, not just are the number of 1, 3, 2 avoiding trees counted by the Catalan numbers, so are the number of binary trees with n plus 1 leaves. So we talked at the beginning of this talk about one Catalan object. I've just introduced another one. It would be nice if this relationship continues further, and in fact it does. Part of the reason why so many of these sequences that I got for trees were showing up in OEIS is they can be rephrased in terms of permutations. And thanks to the permutation patterns community, there's a lot of stuff about permutation patterns in OEIS. So it turns out the number of n-leaf trees that avoid any k-leaf tree pattern is the same as the number of length n-1 permutations avoiding 1, 3, 2, and the increasing permutation of length 1 less than k. And I'd like to convince you why this is true, because it's a very nice picture bijective proof. So it's not just known that both of those are Catalan numbers. There's a very nice bijection between trees with n plus 1 leaves and permutations of length n avoiding 1, 3, 2 that illustrates this. And when you have that bijection down, this falls out naturally. So here is an 8-leaf tree, which means it has 7 internal vertices. And to get a 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutation, I'm going to label the internal vertices in a special way. So the first rule is I'm going to put the largest digit on the root, and then I'm going to make sure that all the digits I put to the left of the root are strictly larger than all the digits I put to the right of the root. So 3, 4, 5, and 6 are going to go somehow on these 4 vertices. 1 and 2 are somehow going to go over here to the right. And then I just continue recursively. So the largest number over here goes on this vertex, the largest number over here goes on this one, and so on. So if I just put the largest number at the root, make sure everything larger is to the left and smaller is to the right, there's my labeling. And then there's a natural way to look at these vertices from left to right. All of this stuff comes before the 7, all of this stuff comes after. So reading these vertices from left to right, I get 5, 6, 3, 4, 7, 1, 2. There's a permutation. And it has to avoid 1, 3, 2, because every time I had a large number, I made sure everything to the left was larger than everything to the right. So this is my bijection between, well, it's not mine. This is a well-known bijection between binary trees and 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutations. Now let's see what happens when we go back to that theorem from the previous slide. So here it is. I claimed that you should avoid 1, 3, 2 in an increasing pattern. Well, it doesn't matter which tree I'm looking at if I'm going to get the same answer anyhow. We knew that from the first part of the talk. So I might as well focus on something similar. And the left comb served us well before, so let's take a look at it again. If you think about the labeling the left comb gets with this bijection, I put k minus 1 on the root, and then k minus 2 here, and so on. And when I read that off, I get the increasing permutation. So that is how this relationship comes out. If you avoid a k-leaf tree, you get the number of permutations avoiding these two patterns. But why did I use the left comb? That's the question that bothers me here. Shouldn't I be able to put any other 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutation here from this bijection? Well, it turns out to be not the case, and to convince you why I can't just put any other permutation I like here, I'll give you some pictures. Here are a few trees with the permutation they correspond to with the bijection from the previous slide. And I want to at least write out the first two. So if I look at this tree right here, this vertex gets labeled with a 4. 2 and 3 are over here, so this gets labeled with a 3, and so on. Right? And this one right here, this has 4 here, 3, 2, 1. And then hopefully this one we can see gets labeled 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. And I want to compare copies of the 3, 2, 1 permutation inside these permutations versus copies of this tree inside of the trees. So for example, this tree, how many copies of this does it have inside of it? None, right? This tree avoids this tree right here, but if you look at the corresponding permutation, how many copies of 3, 2, 1 does this permutation have inside it? 1. Okay, so the numbers don't match up here. So 3, 2, 4, 1 contains 3, 2, 1 ones. What about this tree? How many copies of this comb are inside of this tree?
At least one.
Okay, well it's one of those two. Is it one or two? How many copies of this are inside of here?
The tree.
Yeah, on the tree version, yeah.
One.
Okay, so this contains ones, but how many copies of 3, 2, 1 are inside this permutation? Yeah. So 3, 4, 2, 1 contains 2 copies of 3, 2, 1. And do you see why this discrepancy is happening? There's something funny here. So this contained 3, 2, 1 exactly once. It's from the digits 3, 2, 1. But notice, they got split into 2 different subtrees by a larger vertex that got in the middle of it. Okay, the reason that this 3, 2, 1 didn't translate into a copy of this 3, 2, 1 tree is because this guy got in the way. The same thing is going on here. One of these copies of 3, 2, 1 is sitting right here looking like the 3, 2, 1 tree. But the other copy of 3, 2, 1 came from 2 separate subtrees where there's a larger vertex that got in the way. So I need something to match my trees with permutations where I can forbid a larger digit from breaking things up. And to do that, I'm going to get slightly more complicated pattern notation, but that's why I gave you the graphs, so that it would be easier to digest the new notation. What we actually need here is something called mesh patterns that have only been around in the literature for, I think, about 3 years. And a mesh pattern, you have to draw a picture of it. You can't really just write it down as a list of digits. The graph of a mesh pattern looks just like a regular pattern, except for I take some of these squares in the graph and I shade them in. Okay, you still don't know what those mean until the next slide, but that's what a mesh pattern looks like. A regular pattern where I've shaded in some of the boxes. And a copy of a mesh pattern is when you find the underlying pattern with the dots where all of these shaded regions remain empty. So let's look at a couple examples because I know this took me a while to digest. Do you see any copies of 1, 3, 2 inside of this pattern permutation here? Where? Yeah, the top up here makes a 1, 3, 2 pattern, right? But notice, a copy of this pattern would be a 1, 3, 2, where there's nothing up here between these 2 digits. Well, that's okay. There's nothing over here. That's okay. But there's also nothing sitting below the largest digit. Okay, so this avoids that pattern because I can't find a copy of 1, 3, 2 where this region is empty. On the other hand, this contains that same mesh pattern because, again, there's only one copy of 1, 3, 2. And you can check. This region up here is empty, this region over here is empty, and there's nothing lower down. So these mesh patterns are like classical patterns, but where I can place some really fine restrictions. And now I'll show you how I take care of the weird thing that was happening over there, where I don't want a larger digit to split my pattern up between 2 subtrees.
No.
Okay, just checking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same bijection as before to get the underlying pattern. This still corresponds to 1, 2, 3. This still corresponds to 3, 2, 1. You can check the bijection from before that each of these correspond to the pattern you see with the dots. But every time I have a descent, 2 dots in a row that go downhill, I'm going to shade everything between them and above them so that I can't have a larger digit that breaks my pattern into 2 subtrees. So now, instead of making this match up with the classical pattern 2, 1, 3, it now matches up with this mesh pattern that has 2, 1, 3 inside it, but now I can't have a larger digit splitting things up. And if these aren't fun enough to look at, I'll do an even bigger one on the next slide. The idea is use the bijection we already have to 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutations, but shade in everything between and above any descent. Here's an example of a 9-leaf tree and just how fun these can look. If you took that tree and used our bijection from before, here's the 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutation you would get. Notice every time I have a descent, I've shaded everything between and above. Everything between and above, and so on. So now I have an even fancier correspondence between binary trees and not just 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutations, but really 1, 3, 2 avoiding mesh patterns. And now I get to translate pretty much every theorem I had about trees, non-contiguous trees.
But people have been working on this mesh pattern?
People have been working on mesh patterns, so the main motivation was 1-stack sortable permutations were characterized with classical patterns, 2-stack sortable with barred patterns, and these helped classify 3-stack sortable, and so on. So they came from the sorting literature. But this is a unique occurrence of the ones that look like this. So now, using these mesh patterns, because they help prevent situations like what we saw over here, I can use these mesh patterns that have been used for other things to translate all my tree theorems to permutation theorems. So here we go. Rho T hat is going to be the permutation you get from changing a tree to a 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutation, and then shading in meshes above and between every descent, like we saw on the last couple slides. And then here's what we have. Before, we knew we could put any tree we want here, and we would get the same sequence. Now I have Catalan many different permutation patterns that I can stick in here and get the same sequence as well. Before it was just the increasing one. Now I have Catalan many mesh patterns I can fill in here and also get the same sequence. And I'm unaware of another equivalence thing with mesh results that works for infinitely many values of n. So this is pretty exciting. This is exactly what we were going for. The number of trees with exactly m copies of a tree is exactly the number of 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutations that have exactly the same number of copies of not the classical pattern that goes with the tree, but the mesh pattern. And finally, remember that lovely bivariate generating function for containment in the middle part of the talk? It translates to this. The total number of copies of any non-contiguous tree pattern in the set of all n-leaf trees was the same. It's also the case that the total number of copies of any of these mesh patterns that come from trees in the set of 1, 3, 2 avoiding permutations is independent of which tree you use to get the mesh pattern. And there's been a lot of recent results that look at number of copies of a classical permutation inside of 1, 3, 2 avoiders, so this rounds that out and gives even more patterns that give the same enumeration as some of those results. So now you've heard a lot about trees, how the contiguous ones relate to non-contiguous ones. And now hopefully you have a little bit of an idea of just how great these non-contiguous ones are, not just as a generalization of contiguous trees, but because they can feed us so much more about pattern avoiding permutations. I need to give some credit to various people. So these are the 3 groups of undergraduate students that helped do this. They didn't know about the permutation stuff, but I would not have the tree stuff without their hard work over 3 consecutive summers. And this guy is here, not just because I cited him at the beginning, but each summer I had groups of students. He came, gave a talk to our REU, and served as a consultant for a few days, so his feedback was really useful throughout. I thank you for your attention, and if you want to know more, here you go.
Very much. And now I'll be glad to answer questions. Yeah, some questions.
What about directed graphs avoiding patterns? Has anyone looked at that?
To my knowledge, in this enumerative sense, not that I know of. But that is on my list of things I could be thinking about sitting on my desk at home.
You could do graphs too, but
Yeah.
directed graphs would seem to be closer in spirit
Yes.
to rooted trees.
It's nice to have some structure. The left and right bought us a lot. Yeah,
Not with directed graphs.
right. So as soon as you start loosening up some of the assumptions I had about trees at the beginning, things can get a lot hairier.
In this continuous fraction that you had x for 1 minus x,
Mhm.
so you can also go to infinity. So then
Yeah.
it's something famous probably, no? So in the limit.
I haven't looked at that, but yes, you're right. I probably do get something famous and I should
Yeah.
work it out when I sit down
Yeah,
after the talk. Yeah.
So I've never seen mesh patterns before, but when you define those shaded regions, it has to be sort of with respect to a couple of the other existing entries, right?
Correct. Yeah, so if I go back here, I kind of match this up over 3 particular dots and then check if when I stretch this to match over those 3 dots, the right things are empty. So you kind of reshade where the shaded parts are every time you find a new copy of 132, for example. Yeah.
Again. We're going to take now out for dinner at 6:45 at Evan's restaurant in your watch with. So if you'd like to join us, please let me know right now. Okay, come?